Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. If you're looking to be cheered up, I'm not entirely sure we can help this morning. But if you're interested in the long and fascinating entanglement of human health and human prejudice, I promise you couldn't be in a better place. The historian Joanna Bourke is with us to talk about her new history of pain. And if you think that that most basic of human experiences isn't susceptible to fashion and cultural shifts, think again. Norman Fowler, Health Secretary at the time AIDS first reached this country, believes we're on the brink of a new AIDS crisis and that bigotry is the disease's biggest and most dangerous ally. Don't die of prejudice is his new rallying cry. And don't die of complacency is Jeremy Farrar's, director of the Wellcome Trust, here to argue that unless we act fast on antibiotic resistance, we'll have thrown away one of the greatest medical advances in human history. We start, though, with Joanna Bourke. Joanna, you've written a book, The Story of Pain, from prayer to painkillers. One of the interesting things and counterintuitive things about this is that there is a history of pain. It is something susceptible to cultural change. That seems a difficult idea to get your head around. Just try and help us do it.
Yeah, I mean, what I find really fascinating about pain is that if you actually look at it historically, the way people actually feel has changed dramatically over time. And the way people actually talk about pain, the metaphors they use, the languages they use, have undergone radical shifts. Just if we just need to think about the metaphors that people use, in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, the way people talked was very much in terms of religious understandings of pain. And that, of course, has undergone dramatic shifts in more recent years.
Just because the metaphors change, though, does that mean the pain changes? I mean, are you arguing that a broken leg in the Middle Ages felt to the person who suffered it different to a broken leg feels to us now?
I am actually arguing that, and I know that's a difficult thing to understand, but I think we really need to think about pain, not something that is purely physiological. I mean, clearly, a broken leg is very, very painful. If you have cholera, you're going to have a terrible headache. However, people are always interpreting those physiological symptoms in ways that are inflected by their society, by the languages they have available, by their relationships. I mean, we only have to think about today. For example, the colour of an analgesic pill affects the way that pill affects us. So the actual way we feel is partly physiological, partly bodily. It's also partly emotional, psychological. It's about our relationships. All these things are thrown into the mix. So yes, it does feel different.
Another of the ways that you phrase this is you say that pain is inherently social. I mean, that's another... And that one can take in, but then you add this sentence: there is no such thing as a private pain event. And again, I stumbled. I thought of an example you yourself bring up in the book, Aaron Ralston, the mountaineer who was trapped for 127 hours. He cut off his own arm. Surely at that moment, that was a private pain event. It might have changed when he came out and told us about it, but when he was there in the desert, wasn't it private?
No, it wasn't private, because of course he has been schooled since infancy in the ways in what pain is and the way to respond to pain. I mean, infants right from the moment of birth are taught that this is a pain and this is simply discomfort. They are taught the difference between a stomach ache and sort of that little gurgling, just before lunchtime. So pain, even for him, is social in the ways he's thinking about pain in that terrible, lonely environment is, of course, using language, using metaphors that inform him on what is actually happening to his body.
Would you argue that he was actually less well equipped to deal with it because he'd lived in a time of anaesthetics? In other words, he'd not had the experience of excruciating pain that couldn't be taken away by some means. It was an unusual position for him to be in.
Yeah, I think this is one of the big questions actually in the field. Do people feel more because of anaesthetics and analgesics? And I think really, to be honest, I think the argument can go either way. I think the jury is still out on that issue. What is the case is that because we now have available these kinds of pain relief, sometimes effective, sometimes less effective, that people are much more willing to, therefore, use them, obviously, and appeal to them. We don't want to take that too far because, of course, even today, with effective pain relief, at least from a lot of forms of acute pain, people are still concerned about correct comportment, holding back, not displaying, being a man, coping with your pain is still a highly valorized trait in our society.
One of the great shifts that you talk about in your book is, it's there in the subtitle, From Prayer to Painkillers, with the move to chemical analgesics from, as it were, a moral analgesic. It's rather shocking, your accounts of early... in some respects, religion is a great assistance to people in suffering pain. In other respects, it seems to aggravate and make worse the pain they suffer, it seems to me.
Yeah, in some cases it does. It depends on how you're interpreting pain, how you're interpreting what is happening to you. If you think that pain is a message from God, it's something there to teach you how to react in the world, how to act morally. Nature, if you like, is also inflicting this on you in order that you behave correctly. On the one hand, that can be helpful. Suffer in this world, you don't need to suffer in the next world. But on the other hand, it can actually leave a really powerful stigma, set you outside society. Somehow you're responsible for this terrible thing that's happening to you. So again, it works in both ways, or can work in both ways.
I was very shocked. As late as 1956, a Catholic theologian is arguing that it's fine to give pain relief to somebody who's repentant and asking for a priest, but the bad character has to have pain relief withheld because otherwise you are endangering his soul.
Yes, and that's 1950s, and of course you see this very, very dominantly in the period before that, but I don't think we should forget that those kinds of attitudes are still with us to some degree. There is still this idea that you are responsible for what's happened and that you need to learn how to act correctly.
Norman Fowler, you wanted to come in on that.
I think it's a fascinating point because when I read the book, I saw this passage about, doctors who believe that manual workers don't feel as much pain as lawyers, for example. And I thought, well, okay, that's all in the 18th and 19th century. Then I went on a bit and I found two books which said that small children didn't feel pain like adults. And those books were written in 1938 and 39. That's exactly when I was born. So I suddenly had a kind of rather close interest in all this. And I suppose my question really is this. Do these attitudes still continue? I don't know, prevail? Perhaps not, but do they continue?
Look, let me tell you something really, really shocking. As late as the 1970s, young infants in hospitals having major operations, including amputations, are having them without any form of anaesthetic, let alone analgesic. That is 1970s. So what we see is these major shifts. 18th century, the infant was exquisitely sensitive. Then all of a sudden, mid-19th century, particularly 1870s, all of a sudden infants are regarded as not at all sensitive, and that continues for another century. So this is why I think it's really important, because of course it is the disenfranchised, the poor minorities within our society who are being most affected by these kinds of prejudices.
Jeremy Farrar, I wonder whether you had something to add. The extraordinary racism of some doctors in how people feel pain. You worked in Vietnam for a long time. Did you see a cultural difference about the attitude to pain in your experience?
In fact, I was just about to ask that of Joanna, to what extent she did look at the international dimension, because a lot of what you're describing there in the 1950s and 30s in our society in the UK is prevalent in the rest of the world, and it's not just about access to pain relief, it's about cultural attitudes to pain, some degree that suffering is good for you still. And that people are perceived to be more stoical, which I think is probably nonsense, actually. I think your access to pain relief internationally is going to become an increasingly huge issue, particularly as things like cancer become more prevalent in low and middle income countries globally. So it'd be really interesting to know what you thought about it outside our own society, but internationally.
Yeah, well, I mean, my book is really about Britain and America, but of course there's this huge international literature which I'm absolutely fascinated by for some of the reasons that you give. But I think the central issue, whether we're looking at Vietnam or whether we're looking at 18th century Britain, central thing is to look at pain as it is understood in its full context, the individual's context, as well as the broader cultural context. I mean, if I can just tell my favourite joke here, which sort of epitomizes this, a very famous pain physician has a really bad stomach ache and goes to a doctor, a stomach specialist, and the specialist says, well, where does it hurt? And he looks and he says, well, in my head, of course. These things are all inflected, and this is exactly why culture is important, and also why metaphor is important, because the languages that people in Vietnam or in China are using to express their sensations actually have an effect on how they are feeling it and how they are dealing with it in terms of in context of other people.
You say that there are different languages. You have a nice example of Japanese metaphors for headaches, which I thought sort of slightly contradict your own point. You say, there are different languages in different cultures, but their language was a bear headache and a woodpecker headache. Now, I think that's pretty universal, isn't it? I mean, we all know what that means, and we could tell the difference between a bear headache and a woodpecker headache.
Yes, I think we can, absolutely. I think why I'm interested in those languages is in the context of the McGill Pain Questionnaire, which is the most dominant pain questionnaire in the global context today.
This is a list, it's a kind of thesaurus of pain words, and you can tick off the ones.
Yes, and people tick them off. And I was very interested in this list precisely because it's used globally, and yet it is almost impossible to translate into some languages.
Can you give us a specific example?
For example, the Turkish, when they're trying to translate it into Turkish, it turns out that the concept of sin, the concept of pain as punishment or sin, simply does not exist, was simply untranslatable. Whereas, of course, in the English languages and the Latin languages, the word pain in Latin, where it comes from, means punishment. Now, that is untranslatable in certain other non-Latin languages.
Jeremy Farrar.
Where do you think fear comes into these approaches to pain? I mean, somebody who's suffering is also terrified that their pain means something more, and therefore by lessening it may put them into a position where actually the bad outcomes are lessened. Is fear not a major part of how we respond to pain?
Fear is the most important emotion, I think, when we're looking at pain. And if anyone was to ask me what are the psychological or emotional aspects that are most dominant, fear would definitely be it. And we have a wonderful example of this work in 1944, where Beecher, on the banks of during the Second World War, seeing men being evacuated with severe wounds, asked these men, hundreds of them, are you in pain? And almost all of them said, no, I'm not in pain. But that is because for them, on the beachhead, waiting to be evacuated, there wasn't fear anymore. They had that. All that was in front of them was expectation. Now, when Beecher went back to the States and did the same thing with people who had been severely injured in car accidents, they were all immensely fearful because, of course, for them, everything was worse, so they were in excruciating pain. So I think fear is absolutely crucial.
Before we move on, I just wanted to talk a little bit about sympathy, because you have very interesting things to say about sympathy, the way in which that word changes its meaning, but also this very interesting attitude that doctors have towards pain and pain relief. That there's a sort of sense that to have too much sympathy as a doctor unfits you as a doctor, and that's a very specific historical kind of attitude.
Yes, it is a very specific historical attitude. 18th century physicians who didn't, of course, have access to chemical tests and the technologies that we have today, for them sympathy was absolutely crucial to the diagnostic and indeed the healing process. So the scientist was supposed to be a man of feeling who elicited comments, elicited pain narratives, pain stories from their patients, and by eliciting this actually put the person within the context sex and therefore could diagnose and cure. Now, that is not the case from the 19th century, where most effective way is simply to get some tests done, some blood tests, neurological tests, etc. So, in fact, pain stories become redundant and indeed become a negative thing. So you get them, instead of the man of feeling, you get the man of science coming in, where the proper comportment is a much more distant way of dealing with patients.
You're smiling broadly, Jeremy Farrar, and I'm not quite sure why.
Well, I'm just listening to the description of the medical profession, which I sort of represent here, I suppose. I would defend it a little bit. I think that caricature's, right, and we all know that it's not necessarily doctors that provide the best pain relief to whoever it is. It may be all sorts of people in the paramedical world that are better at listing it. But I do think there's been a bit of a change since, let's say, the 1950s, 60s and 70s in something of that white coat syndrome. I mean, if I look at colleagues and friends of mine who are doctors or are receiving care, I do think those attitudes have changed in for the positive.
We're going to move on and talk about another great attitudinal shift because I want to bring you in, Norman Fowler. You've written a book called AIDS Don't Die of Prejudice, very pointedly changing the slogan that you famously introduced as a health minister, "Don't die of ignorance," to a new one. Tell us why you think another campaign is needed.
Well, I'm not saying, incidentally, that ignorance has disappeared. It certainly hasn't.
Well, no, that's very clear in your book. Yeah.
But what I think has become very clear is that prejudice and discrimination has taken over worldwide as being the big obstacle to the war, if I can put it that way, against HIV. And the reason for that is this. I mean, people don't know these figures, but I mean, with 35 million people have died already. 35 million around the world have died from AIDS. We've got about 36 million people now with HIV living around the world. The awful thing is that half of those, about 18 million, don't know. They are undiagnosed. And one of the reasons that people don't go forward for tests is because if you're in Uganda or if you're in a whole range of other countries, 80 countries, there are laws against homosexuality. And it's not just the law. It is families who will throw a gay young man out of their house. In India, you can kind of get women who are completely ostracised if they get HIV. So I think that prejudice, discrimination, stigma has become such an obstacle in the way that unless we are able to tackle that effectively, I fear that we're not going to make anything like the progress we should.
We'll come back to what we might do about it. But if fear and prejudice is an obstacle now, it was an even greater obstacle 20, 30 years ago, wasn't it? Just give us a little bit of historical context. I mean, when you were there, what's your first intimation that something gravely serious is happening?
Well, when I was doing the health job, I suppose, 84, 85, it started coming on to the agenda. And although you're right in saying that fear was one of the issues, it was also, in some way, my help, because you could get the attention of the public in a way that, frankly, you can't today in this country, because here came this new disease coming in. They didn't know what it was about. They knew it affected young people, but you obviously did have quite a number of people who simply reacted to it and said, well, look, you're just going to have to leave these people to their own fate. It's not our responsibility. And you had, totally idiotic and wacky suggestions like that everyone with HIV should be, should be put on an island.
Lord
somewhere.
Monkton, I think, wanted quarantine.
I would hate to actually use particular names. He wasn't the only one, I have to say either.
But the point was that these arguments were happening in cabinet. They weren't. It wasn't that the government was proposing to do something and getting simply arguments from outside. You had real problems in cabinet in some cases. Well, and indeed, you had to face down Mrs. Thatcher.
Yes, Mrs. Thatcher's, Margaret Thatcher's view was kind of slightly different one. She was opposed to actually setting out the detail of HIV. How it was contracted and what you needed to do to prevent you getting it. And her view was, And this was the view of other people as well. The chief rabbi, I remember, lecturing me for some time on this subject. It was also his view. Their view was that if you actually put this information into the public domain, then young people who knew nothing about this area would be find out about it, would be attracted, and would somehow kind of wish to follow. That always seemed to me a totally illogical argument, because the whole purpose of what we were trying to do was to prevent people following. And indeed, if you look at the figures afterwards, that's exactly what we achieved. People are not fools. I mean, if you say you're going to die, because at that stage, remember, we didn't have any drugs. And people were literally dying. And the only thing we could do was public education. And all the figures afterwards do show that the public education that we did do there, the campaign, which was much criticised with being, too over the top, etc., it had an impact. HIV came down, and also other sexual diseases came down as well.
The chief rabbi actually put it this way. He said, it tells people not what is right, but how to do wrong and get away with it. That was the essential objection, wasn't it?
That was his objection,
you were
yes.
spreading sin. You weren't spreading health.
Yes.
You were spreading sin.
It was one of an array of arguments that was used against me. But he was passionate on this. We had a discussion for about, I suppose, the best part of an hour. And what you've just quoted was an aide memoir he left at the end. He did actually compliment me on the energy of the campaign, but it was quite clear that he didn't believe a word of it, really. I mean, he just didn't. I mean, and the churches were quite interested, not just the chief rabbi. Churches were quite interesting on this. And it's an issue which is still a worldwide issue. The churches actually didn't say it. They kept out of it. I went to see the Archbishop, I went to see the Cardinal Hume, and they were very kind, as you can imagine, but they didn't enter the argument. Now you find, if you go around the world, go to Uganda, you find the kind of churches, the Anglican Church, for goodness sake, is actually supporting some of these extreme policies. And I think there is a message for the church in all this. They're one of the organisations that could most persuade people to change their ways. They could most persuade people against prejudice and against discrimination, but they remain at times remarkably silent.
I want to ask you about something which you mentioned only in a footnote in your book, which is section 28. And I do this not to put you on the spot, but I think it's fascinating that at the same time as you're pursuing this campaign, which is completely open-minded, the Conservative Party passes essentially a piece of homophobic legislation. Did you vote for that?
I can't remember, but I'm pretty certain I might well have done.
And what I'm interested in is how do you move? Because that's a paradox. There are you have, you go to San Francisco, you shake hands with an AIDS sufferer long before Princess Diana does it. And yet there's this...
No, it was a mistake. It was a terrible mistake. It was a ghastly mistake on our part. It was certainly a mistake on my part. It wasn't my legislation, obviously, remotely. But it was a terrible mistake on our part because it stigmatised gay people in a way which was totally unjustified. And of course, now you get the same thing in Russia, for example, but they do it in a much worse and a much more extreme manner. But nevertheless, it's in the same stream, and it's that sort of thing. I mean, if we all think back on our careers, we're never going to say we got all these things right, but we should have got that right. We should never have done that. And that's what I say in the book.
You absolutely do. But was there anything in that experience that would say how you can get Russia from a place in which all of its MPs are voting for that kind of legislation to a place where they're not?
I think it's a very interesting question. I'm not sure. I think that in Britain it was simply shown to be a totally unnecessary piece of legislation, a totally discriminatory piece of legislation, and the public in a free society took that view. I think in Russia you've got a different view, and in Ukraine, actually, to be honest, you have got a view where if you campaign against gay people, that is a popular issue with the public. If governments get into a hole, they start
They're
campaigning
very
against
effective.
gay people.
Jeremy Farrar, you wanted to
Yeah, I
go?
just wanted to come in, just two comments, Norman. One is, do you not think there are parallels today with that and with how we're handling drug abuse today, in terms of not making it explicit in terms of public health campaigns and putting it behind the scenes and ignoring it, and the big arguments within political parties about what we should be doing about drug abuse, which also is a major way of spreading HIV, of course.
I do, absolutely. You're entirely right. It's the one thing I find so sad about the whole experience is that we ran this major campaign. All the figures showed it was successful. Have we run a campaign like that since? We have not. The fact is, no commercial company would run a campaign of this kind and then go off the air for the next quarter of a century. But when you come to things like drug users, drug abuse, then I think we should be much more explicit. But it's not just that. We need to talk openly about, for example, sex work, which again is another way of actually spreading HIV. We have a most extraordinary situation in this country. I won't try and go into all the complexities of the law, but people might think it's illegal, but in fact, it is not illegal if you've got one sex worker working in one single flat, etc. That is perfectly legal, and the police won't prosecute. So when in New South Wales they put sex work on an entirely business-like basis, they've never, and people say that's the most astonishing thing to do, couldn't possibly do it. Actually, we do it here. The only difference is we keep it as a small business, and it's the only requirement is that business shall not actually get any bigger.
We're back to, as it were, moral judgment here in a lot of these cases, aren't we? I was very interested that you said, shocking statistic that HIV prevalence in Washington is equal to Nigeria and Rwanda, which is partly down to poverty, but also because Republican and Democrat politicians have withdrawn funding on needle exchanges, so you can't have clean needles, which is a purely moralistic decision. But has huge...
and it's totally against what the administration, of course, wanted. The administration, there was a long-standing ban on needle exchange methadone at the federal level. That was changed by the administration. Then they came to one of these big disputes, as we've been seeing over the last few years, and the whole thing was dropped again. So it's gone back into the position that the Americans will not fund needle exchange. The worst thing of all is that the Russians, they're old Cold War foes, people they're not that apparently friendly with at this moment. The Russians claim this is a great success and that the Americans are now following the Russian example. And it really is deeply ironic and very tragic.
I find this very, very interesting. And I guess where I want to kind of push you a bit more is what can be done about it. It does seem to be the case that it's attitudes that are driving this. Governments are influenced by people, need for votes, etc. There is this notion about, poor people are affected by these issues much more than the wealthy people, even though, of course, as you note, there's some nice subtleties there. So I guess what I really want to push you on is, is it simply a matter of attitudes to get more funding, to get a more emphasis on the problem, or is it actually a wider problem about inequality in society more generally?
Well, it's obviously both of those, and I think in all respects we could get more resource going in. I do have to say, as far as the National Health Service is concerned in this country, much criticised, much abused. As far as the NHS is concerned, I think it does rather well in public health terms compared with many other systems. Because if you go to the States, for example, people come off treatment. We all think, get onto treatment, that's the end of it. It isn't. They drop off. And but the big thing we should be doing is we should be concentrating upon developing a vaccine. Now, I'm not saying developing a vaccine is easy. I've now joined the board of a international vaccine initiative in New York. But I think I am persuaded by person after person, expert after expert, who says the only way we are ever going to finish this is by a vaccine. We're not, and that is not going to get rid of the discrimination and the prejudice, but it is going to go round it if we can actually develop it.
There is a problem, though, which you note in your book, that developing a vaccine for a big pharmaceutical company is a huge investment. But not only that, it's an investment which is cutting off their own revenue stream, because they're taking patients from lifetime treatment to...
No, you're absolutely right, and what it does mean, frankly, is that the only people who are going to be, I think, the financiers of this is basically going to be governments. And to do the American government justice, that's what they're doing. I'm afraid the British government has just cut back on vaccine development. I think that's a very short-sighted policy.
Jeremy Farrar, you must be aware of the issues around this.
Yeah,
in the Wellcome Trust.
Yes, I agree with Norman. Can I just take you back to the mid-1980s, though? I was a junior doctor here.
I can never get away from the mid-1980s.
I was a junior doctor here in London, and during the mid-1980s, and it was the sort of defining moment of my career, really, which was seeing mostly young people coming in and dying of untreatable infections. And what you did during those 80s, I think, was extraordinarily powerful. But 2 years after you left office, the British government stopped the sexual attitudes survey in the UK, which banned the research councils from studying it. The Wellcome Trust stepped in and funded it. But, I mean, that sort of attitude prevailed even after you left, and having had such a successful mid-1980s, it's a really depressing thought that happened.
It was a depressing thought. It was a depressing action. I mean, the fact was that at the top of government, I think Margaret Thatcher didn't really have her heart in all this in any event, and certainly didn't have her heart in having an inquiry into the private sexual habits of the population, with how she would see it. She didn't see the point of that. I mean, the point of it obviously was that the more knowledge you can have in this respect, the more you can do in terms of public health. And I remember someone giving me a remarkably accurate figure about kind of one aspect. And where did it come from? I think it came from the McKinsey report, which was 1950s in the United States. And we had no evidence on this whatsoever. And that's the evidence that we were trying to put together. So, and even now, this thing is not remotely over. Governments do not like going into issues of sexual policy. I mean, it can be embarrassing. They can be shot at from every conceivable side. I was just as much, well, not just as much, but I was certainly shot at from those who were basically on my side as from the other way, because they were saying, the campaign is too over the top, etc., etc. It scares people. It stigmatises people in their own way. But and you can see, therefore, why governments all over the world do fight shy of it.
One of the reasons you want a vaccine and you think it's so urgent, I mean, we should perhaps make clear, if it's not clear to listeners, you're not saying this is a problem we've got and we've just taken too long to solve it. You're saying this problem is going to increase in scale and become exponentially more dangerous if we don't do something.
Well, I mean, it's pretty difficult. It's pretty dangerous already. I mean, you've got 17 million people.
But that assumption that people make, which is, oh, well, there are antiretrovirals, it's not a death sentence anymore, that has its own dangers now.
It has its own dangers because people, particularly in the West, particularly perhaps in this country, say, right, OK, if I get HIV, it may be a bit of a problem, but I can go and get a pill and one pill a day. I only say this: I have never met anyone who has HIV who thinks that this is a quiet and successful life. It preserves their life, but there are problems, and everyone knows, or should know, that there are problems that go with it.
Yeah, no, it's too late. But, I mean, this is exactly the problem that you're facing as well, Jeremy Farrar, but with regard to antibiotics, that in many ways people have come to rely on antibiotics. They've come to believe that they will always be there, and it's and that is enormously dangerous in itself.
It is, and it's not just antibiotics. It is also antiviral drugs, yeah. And where Norman's absolutely right, is ultimately this will require not just a medical solution, it will also require a social approach and a social solution and changes of behaviour, but ultimately you will need a vaccine. And I actually think we're living in a honeymoon phase in HIV. drug resistance in HIV is inevitable at some point. I'm not saying it's tomorrow or the next day or it's 10 or 20 years from now, but it will come at some point.
This is a biological fact because of the way the virus operates and because of the
That's
way...
right. We have. There's been a transformation in HIV. I mean, the world together has done a remarkable job. It's a long way to go, as someone says, and he's absolutely right to highlight it now. But it has done a remarkable job from going from no knowledge of what was causing these infections when I was a young doctor, through to transforming what people have talked about being like a chronic condition, for instance, like diabetes. That's a mistake to think of it like that, because diabetes doesn't change. The virus, it's an RNA virus. It changes all the time, and therefore, I believe, drug resistance to HIV is inevitable, and therefore that's why a vaccine is going to be critical.
You recently called for the equivalent of an intergovernmental panel on climate change, that we need a global initiative to tackle antibiotic resistance. It's that grave.
I believe it is. It's only, say, my mother's generation who would have lived through the era of, she's 91, she lived through the era of pre-antibiotic era. None of us in this room remember that period, and it was remarkable. I mean, young children died of small things. But it wasn't just infections. It covers the whole of medicine. So you couldn't do routine surgery. A hip operation would be almost impossible without an antibiotic. HIV will come back at some point to be untreatable in the absence of a vaccine. Tuberculosis is rising in London as it is in much of the world. And increasingly, because we're so much better connected with the rest of the world, what happens in the Democratic Republic of Congo or Vietnam is relevant in London tomorrow. And so things that are happening in terms of drug resistance there will inevitably come here. So seeing this as a British issue or a European issue is absolutely wrong. This has to come at a global level. And
how do you start? You say in your book, 20 tonnes of antibiotics produced every hour, I think. $30 billion industry per annum. There's a huge incentive. You can put a figure on it to keep producing them, keep pumping them out. How do you police and control that?
Absolutely right, and that's why it's not just going to be a medical solution. This is going to require a social approach as well, both in the animal sector, where huge amounts of antibiotics are used for growth promoters, and in the human sector. We all go to a GP, into hospital, and expect to be given antibiotics. The way we approach these phenomenal group of drugs is going to have to change. There will have to be regulation. And just come back as well to your comments about the pharmaceutical industry. We are also disincentivising anybody to produce any of these antibiotics, antiviral drugs, because you're only mostly using it for short terms. It's much better to produce a statin, which somebody can take forever. And at some point, governments, because of the gravity of this issue, governments are going to have to step in to incentivise the industry in order to produce these drugs.
I just think you put your finger on one of what I think is one of the most difficult of the policy issues. I mean, governments are really quite good at financing treatment. If you've got a casualty, they see the casualty and they can count the casualty and they can put resource, we hope, into it. Doing prevention, they're notoriously bad at, because treasuries, frankly, don't believe the figures. I mean, they would say what you're saying, well, it could happen, but there's no guarantee that it will happen, so we won't do anything at all. And I think it's that kind of dilemma that gets in the way of all the prevention. It's a really big gap in everything we're doing in health.
But both what Norman's saying and Jeremy is saying here is that we actually need something like the politics of fear, because we have become far too complacent about this. And I think this also applies not only to these very, very serious chronic afflictions, but also to chronic diseases more generally, whereby people with chronic pain, for example, are routinely dismissed because everyone thinks, well, either they must have done something to deserve it, or they are faking it, or somehow it won't happen to me.
But yes,
but I also think Norman's point is very important about the way I think politicians think. It is much easier to deal with a crisis than something which is out there at some point, and we see parallels between antimicrobial resistance and we see parallels with climate change. And how do you persuade governments and all of us to make those changes today, which may be painful, it may require change of our ways of living, but which are going to be essential 20, 30 years from now. It's very it's easier to respond. I'm very close to SARS and bird flu and all of those things. It's much easier to galvanise interest in those than it is in something which is not a crisis, but which is going to become one.
But of course there's a terrible double bind, which you write about, which is that if you alert people to a danger and then the danger doesn't quite match up to your warnings, I mean, because you've taken action in some cases, everybody says, oh, you were just crying wolf.
No, you get no brownie points for preventing something, as Norman quite rightly says. I think there's another issue here, which actually, with obviously some people around this table's notable exceptions, but overall, round the world, ministries of health are weak ministries. In most governments around the world, they're positions where people come in for a few years on the road to something bigger and better. And that's a tragedy. Education and health, two of the really fundamentals of life, often are not the strongest ministries within government. And if we don't shift that, I think we're going to have real challenges of responding to both the educational and health challenges of today and tomorrow.
It's not only the domestic departments, but you make a point in what you've written about the World Health Organization. Now, WHO does some very useful and valuable work, but anyone thinking that it is a strong executive arm, I think, needs to think again. I remember going to the WHO and as a health minister, and I made a speech for 10 minutes, and there was a long line of ministers, health ministers, making speeches for 10 minutes. I sat down, people would come up, ministers would come up, didn't agree with a word I'd said, shake me by the hand and congratulate me on the speech. I mean, it's a very funny way of making world
you write
policy.
about how cumbersome it is, but how do you make an organisation like that less cumbersome?
Well, I think we do. It desperately needs to be reformed, of course. It was set up in the 1940s at a totally different era. The world looked different. But we do have to accept the World Health Organization is representative of these ministries of health. They're the secretariat, effectively, of those ministries. So we can blame WHO, and I've been critical of them, but we also have to look at the ministries, because that's where the real power base lies in order to change policies.
We've got about a minute left, so just very quickly, it's been a programme full of alarm. Are you essentially optimistic about our ability to deal with this?
I'm enormously optimistic because actually I'm a great believer in it may be slow and it may be cumbersome and we may need to push it, but ultimately I think society and science together will answer these questions.
I'm not so optimistic as that, because I think that there's a lot of attitudes to change, and I think as long as we have this barrier of prejudice and discrimination, particularly against gay people, lesbians, transgender, all those people, I think we're not going to make the progress that we should.
Well, actually, I'm surprisingly an optimist, because precisely for the reason that Jeremy mentioned, that people go into medical professions, nursing professions, caring professions, precisely because they want to help. And anyone who has a chronically ill family member is passionately involved in the sympathy process.
OK, so we'll put our faith in sympathy then. Thank you to all of my guests. Jeremy Farrar, Director of the Wellcome Trust, Norman Fowler's AIDS Don't Die of Prejudice, and Joanna Bourke's The Story of Pain are both out now. Next week I'll be talking about badly behaved women making history with Julie Bindell, Helen Castor, Joyce DiDonato and Erica Wyman. They will all, I'm sure, be impeccably behaved. For now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
Radical shifts. If we just need to think about the metaphors that people use. Along in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, the way people talked was very much in terms of religious understandings of pain, and that, of course, has undergone dramatic shifts in more recent years.
Just because the metaphors change, though, does that mean the pain changes? I mean, are you arguing that a broken leg in the Middle Ages felt to the person who suffered it different to a broken leg feels to us now?
I am actually arguing that, and I know that's a difficult thing to understand, but I think we really need to think about pain, not something that is purely physiological. I mean, clearly a broken leg is very, very painful. If you have cholera, you're going to have a terrible headache. However, people are always interpreting those physiological symptoms in ways that are inflected by their society, by the languages they have available, by their relationships. I mean, we only have to think about today. For example, the colour of an analgesic pill affects the way that pill affects us. So the actual way we feel is partly physiological, partly bodily. It's also partly emotional, psychological. It's about our relationships. All these things are thrown into the mix. So yes, it does feel different.
Another of the ways that you phrase this is you say that pain is inherently social. I mean, that's another... And that one can take in, but then you add this sentence: there is no such thing as a private pain event. And again, I stumbled. I thought of an example, you yourself repentant and asking for a priest. But the bad character has to have pain relief withheld, because otherwise you are endangering his soul.
Yes, and I mean, that's 1950s, and of course you see this very, very dominantly in the period before that, but I don't think we should forget that those kinds of attitudes are still with us to some degree. There is still this idea that, that you are responsible for what's happened and that you need to learn how to act correctly.
Norman Fowler, you wanted to come in on that.
I mean, I think it's a fascinating point because when I read the book, I saw this passage about, doctors who believe that manual workers don't feel as much pain as lawyers, for example. And I thought, well, okay, that's all in the 18th and 19th century. Then I went on a bit and I found two books which said that small children didn't feel pain like adults. And those books were written in 1938 and 39. That's exactly when I was born. So I suddenly had a kind of rather close interest in all this. And I suppose my question really is this. Do these attitudes still continue? I don't know, prevail? Perhaps not, but do they continue?
Look, let me tell you something really, really shocking. As late as the 1970s, young infants in hospitals having major operations, including amputations, are having them without any form of anaesthetic, let alone analgesic. That is 1970s.
Bring up in the book Aaron Ralston, the mountaineer who was trapped for 127 hours. He cut off his own arm. Surely at that moment, that was a private pain event. It might have changed when he came out and told us about it, but when he was there in the desert, wasn't it private?
No, it wasn't private, because of course he has been schooled since infancy in the ways in what pain is and the way to respond to pain. I mean, infants right from the moment of birth are taught that this is a pain and this is simply discomfort. They are taught the difference between a stomach ache and sort of that little gurgling, just before lunchtime. So pain, even for him, is social in the ways he's thinking about pain in that terrible, lonely environment is, of course, using language, using metaphors that inform him on what is actually happening to his body.
Would you argue that he was actually less well equipped to deal with it because he'd lived in a time of anaesthetics? In other words, he'd not had the experience of excruciating pain that couldn't be taken away by some means. It was an unusual position for him to be in.
Yeah, I think this is one of the big questions actually in the field. Do people feel more because of anaesthetics and analgesics? And I think really, to be honest, I think the argument can go either way. I think the jury is still out on that issue. What is the case is that because we now have available these kinds of pain relief, sometimes effective, sometimes less effective, that people are much more willing to, therefore, use them, obviously, and appeal to them. We don't want...
Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. If you're looking to be cheered up, I'm not entirely sure we can help this morning. But if you're interested in the long and fascinating entanglement of human health and human prejudice, I promise you couldn't be in a better place. The historian Joanna Bourke is with us to talk about her new history of pain. And if you think that most basic of human experiences isn't susceptible to fashion and cultural shifts, think again. Norman Fowler, Health Secretary at the time AIDS first reached this country, believes we're on the brink of a new AIDS crisis and that bigotry is the disease's biggest and most dangerous ally. Don't die of prejudice is his new rallying cry. And don't die of complacency is Jeremy Farrar's, director of the Wellcome Trust, here to argue that unless we act fast on antibiotic resistance, we'll have thrown away one of the greatest medical advances in human history. We start, though, with Joanna Bourke. Joanna, you've written a book, The Story of Pain, from prayer to painkillers. One of the interesting things and counterintuitive things about this is that there is a history of pain. It is something susceptible to cultural change. That seems a difficult idea to get your own head around. Just try and help us do it.
Yeah, I mean, what I find really fascinating about pain is that if you actually look at it historically, the way people actually feel actually has changed dramatically over time. And the way people actually talk about pain, the metaphors they use, the languages they use, have undergone. Take that too far, because of course, even today, with effective pain relief, at least from a lot of forms of acute pain, people are still concerned about correct comportment. Holding back, not displaying, being a man, coping with your pain is still a highly valorized trait in our society.
One of the great shifts that you talk about in your book is, it's there in the subtitle, From Prayer to Painkillers, with the move to chemical analgesics from, as it were, a moral analgesic. It's rather shocking, your accounts of early... in some respects, religion is a great assistance to people in suffering pain. In other respects, it seems to aggravate and make worse the pain they suffer, it seems to me.
Yeah, in some cases it does. It depends on how you're interpreting pain, how you're interpreting what is happening to you. If you think that pain is a message from God, it's something there to teach you how to react in the world, how to act morally. Nature, if you like, is also inflicting this on you in order that you behave correctly. On the one hand, that can be helpful. Suffer in this world, you don't need to suffer in the next world. But on the other hand, it can actually leave a really powerful stigma, set you outside society. Somehow you're responsible for this terrible thing that's happening to you. So again, it works in both ways, or can work in both ways.
I was very shocked. As late as 1956, a Catholic theologian is arguing that it's fine to give pain relief to somebody who's